Proud to be a member of today's talk, and I will be sharing a presentation on how to deploy PWA Studio on AWS ECS Fargate, the serverless way. My name is Ray Bachman. I'm a senior business solution architect at Adobe Professional Services, and I've been working now with the Adobe software, the Magento software since 2008, the beta version. Been certified on numerous levels from Magento 1 up until to Magento 2, including AWS. And that's also something that I definitely would like to share to you today on how to use the benefits of Magento and exploring that on AWS. Let's join me, please. There's a big disclaimer before I start a little deeper. The following slides contain my personal interpretation that may differ from the official Adobe product position, so please be aware of that. A couple of years ago, when we started with Magento 2, I wrote a Magento 2 cookbook. And this particular cookbook, and this is not the story about the cookbook, but I wanted to create some stories on how to do things. Well, this is exactly the same story. How do we deploy PWA Studio on ECS AWS? So let's start cooking. Let me get a little bit background on some of the things that we have been working with at Adobe Professional Services. There's this client who's currently start using PWA Studio, and his goal is to deploy PWA Studio not on one environment, but on multi-environments. The aim is even to deploy 30 plus countries around the globe. So you can imagine if we would like to deploy that in an efficient way, that just using PWA out of the box with the node modules included and running that within an environment could be a good option. But from a scalability standpoint, we want to have more flexibility on how to deploy that. From a basic standpoint, for those who are listening, there's one single command that we can use on how to deploy PWA Studio. So once you have a project, you can use run build, and based on that, a directory called dist, distribution, will fill up all the files you needed. Those are mainly the JavaScript files that we need to run our PWA environment. Within PWA Studio, the node server automatically uses this directory to serve its content across. What we're trying to do here is not to use the basic node functionality, but use this specific folder, because initially this folder is static, and this static folder can be used to deploy this within AWS in a serverless fashion without using any additional functionality that you start using from a build. The nicest thing is that if we look at PWA Studio and you open the package.json file, you see a whole list on several commands. Some probably will be used often, some a little bit less. What we're trying to do later on is I will be adding a new command which can be used to build a serverless command and deploy that automatically throughout CI/CD on AWS. So let's start continuing how we can continue that on AWS. Well, AWS in basic has a functionality which is called ECS, Elastic Container Services, also known as Fargate. It creates and manages the functionality to create PWA itself and share that across all channels using native AWS tools. And those are pretty unique, to be honest, but more on that later. Within AWS, there's an option to use pipelines, also known as CI/CD, creating and managing your PWA Studio across the region using a functionality tool called AWS Copilot. And Copilot is a CI tool which can be used as a developer to easily create and deploy environments into the AWS environment, but also more on this later. An important one within the AWS functionality is that we like to scale. AWS itself has numerous ways to scale flexible. This easy way of scaling, leveraging AWS auto-scaling functionality, will help us easily to scale when needed. Lastly, and this is something maybe new for those listening, is that while using this serverless fashion, we don't initially need to run a ECS2 functionality. So ECS is normally the instance itself where you can install Magento or even PWA, but we are not using this kind of functionality. So we will use basic functionality of AWS to make this serverless in an easy way to deploy. So what are the 4 steps to get started within AWS ECS Fargate? Well, first of all, you need to create an AWS account. This sounds pretty straightforward, but make sure that you use your own or your business account and you have the right credentials. On top of those credentials, we need to make sure that from an access standpoint, we have the correct configuration set. I will share a little bit more documentation on this later. That sometimes can be a challenge, depending, of course, on the policy rules that apply. It took me some time, to be honest, to have the right settings fixed, making sure that once I start deploying, everything is in order. So be aware if some things off or not connecting right now, always go back to AWS and look at your AMM settings. Next one up is Copilot. That's something that I already touched a little bit earlier on, and that's something that we will go into a little bit deeper. Copilot, I sometimes compare it to our own Magento tool, ECE. So ECE are the tools on Adobe Commerce Cloud that we can use to deploy environments. This is a tool which is kind of similar. And there's a lot of documentation around that, but more on that later. And lastly but not least, we need to make sure that our local setup is set up correctly. And also some little bit more detail on that, on some of the scripts that I create that might help you to deploy your PWA Studio environment much easier on AWS ECS Fargate. So how do we continue? Well, let's start with a demo. Follow me while I close this window and I will switch over to this repository. I hope everybody can view this and continue. One important thing is once deploying your run build script from PWA Studio is that it will create a whole list of files within your distribution directory, also known as dist. This is a copy of just one of the projects that I wanted to start. So this is just a checkout of all the files which are automatically deployed within that environment. What I've done is to make it simple. And again, this is not the best example to show, but let's start with a basic overview, is that I wanted to have this environment up and running to be hosted within a Docker container. And this can be done from a local environment. So what I've done is I updated my package.json file. What I've done is I only updated a small script adding a node server and a server.js file and using our dependencies. And these are the only dependencies that we need. So the upward server from Magento, a React component, of course, and you can use Express. It's not mandatory, but there's a way you can use either either Node.js or Express for running it as a server, but it's not needed. So for the basic right now, I just created a simple script which starts with start and then the Node.js server itself. So let's look at the server.js file that I created. It's a really small JS script, not really that spectacular, I would say. And the only thing that I've created right now within the script is that I added the upward server up to a Magento backend URL. Some out there, and had some discussions with some of the developers, this is I would say, best practice based out of the Magento stack, but there are some options to remove the upward server and just use Nginx. So it's either possible, but for this example, I wanted to use the upward capability and serving this within a Docker container. So once we've updated those components, then I created a small Docker Compose file. And this Docker Compose file, it's pretty standard. I would say if you're a little bit familiar with Docker, otherwise I would say please go ahead and get yourself updated. That really helped me to see if this environment locally works. So what I've done is, again, to summarize, I created this distribution folder with all the necessary files. I added the package.json, I added server.js, and if you apply Docker to that mix, you can see if the Docker container locally is running fine. Why is this important? Because if the Docker container breaks from the beginning, then we have a problem, because that Docker container itself doesn't have the ability to fix itself, of course, once you deploy this to AWS. So make sure once we create this that everything is in order before we start pushing that. And just one small example over here where I have this Docker file created and making sure that everything has been running. So what you could do is copy or clone this repository and run the Docker compose functionality, and you will see automatically that this environment checks out automatically. So the next step is, we've created a Docker container. We know that Docker container is running. We know that all the functionality to our Magento backend is running. So what's up next? Well, over here, I got a little bit more into detail on what kind of functionality is needed to deploy that. So the best next step that we wanted to do is start using our AWS Copilot. And it's a really small file that you can install on your Mac, Windows or Linux distribution. I would say please have a look at the AWS Copilot tutorials itself. But following that, this is a guideline that I wanted to create, which AWS IAM rules are necessary, making sure that this works out of the box. So I would say please have a look again at the repository if you would like to continue that. So once we have everything up and running, the next step that we wanted to do is that we want to start Copilot itself. While running the Copilot init script, it automatically starts asking us several questions in regards to what's the application name, do we want to use a load balancer, and where is the Docker file located. And you can use even a name for if it's a test or production environment. Once these questions are being asked, automatically in your repository, and scroll a little bit up, there's a directory created automatically. That's the Copilot directory. This Copilot directory automatically creates a manifest file with all the necessary components that we just created. Of course, you can adapt them when needed, depending, of course, on how much CPU or memory you would like to use. But bear with me, looking at some tests and stress tests that I've done, the basics of these are pretty fine to even start running test or production environments. PWA Studio doesn't need that much to run on a serverless environment. So I would say have a look and try to adapt where needed. So if that's in order and we have everything created and everything is locally created in AWS, there's also an option to delete, of course, the application. That's Copilot app delete, and it automatically destroys all services within AWS. So ideally, you don't need to go even in AWS to remove all the services that are being created on the background. And keep in mind, many AWS services are automatically created from load balancer to the repository up until domains and SSL certificates. More later on those SSL certificates, because there's definitely more to it to configure that. And I would even recommend, if you're not familiar enough with AWS, please check out some tutorials or even do some training or even get certified like I did. Because while being certified and knowing a little bit more on AWS helps you to start debugging. Once we have everything set up correctly, well, the next thing that we wanted to do, of course, is to run a CI/CD pipeline. Because, I mean, pushing the code automatically to this environment, we want to make sure that every Git commit that we can do automatically creates, if that's, of course, needed. So here are some additional commands. I'm not going to read through all of them, but it's pretty well documented. I would say have a look at the repositories on how to create a production environment or even a test environment. And if you don't feel like these are the environments that you need, you can automatically drop them, and nothing will be charged after all, which is pretty flexible. And this is a list again of multiple commands that can be used while running Copilot in the background. Again, like I mentioned, if you would like to configure SSL, here is some documentation around how to do that, and making sure everything is all right and set up correctly. So from a CI/CD perspective, the only thing that we need to do, once of course created with Copilot, is that we also need to run the Copilot pipeline init functionality, and that automatically creates the functions within AWS to run the necessary pipeline specifications, and connect this not only to GitHub, Bitbucket, but also GitHub Enterprise. So there's a lot of flexibility, I would say, to connect your repositories into this environment. And to be honest, I was really thrilled to see how much power only lies in this Copilot init functionality. If you would like to tweak some of the specifications later on, you can go back on top into the Copilot directory. Within pipeline, we will see what kind of branch I'm using. Currently, for this example, I'm using a master branch, but you can imagine if you like to have a staging branch or test branch to deploy to, make sure you have the appropriate settings, not only in the files, but also connected to AWS, and what kind of environment it should be. So once we have those environments set, AWS automatically updates them. And this is just one small example of a build spec that AWS uses. You don't need to change it. If there's any need to change, you can use, of course, but I would say out of the box, this comes pretty good configured by AWS itself. So there's no need to update any reference over here, but it's good to have a look in case you definitely would like to use it. So let me go back to the bottom. Let's see if we have discovered all of the things. Oh yeah, also a nice thing, make sure that once you run all the specifications, is that the following services on the background automatically get created. So although the power lies in one command to rule them all, on the background, AWS creates multiple services which are getting charged, some more than others. But bear with me, I will share a little bit more on pricing later on, how expensive it is. But for this example that I've created, it was pretty decent to see how much it would be from a Fargate perspective. So I would say, roughly speaking, one environment could be around $30+. Let me continue an example on AWS CLI. I'm not going through all of them, but have a look at Copilot CLI. You will see how to get started, what kind of community lies around the Copilot functionality. And there's so much power, even in case you have like multiple load balancers, or you would like to have health checks configured to that, or particular IP addresses that needs to be applied. Everything is possible within Copilot. It's a pretty decent tool. To be fair, even it has the functionality to have backend services. So in theory, Magento itself, and I haven't configured that yet, could run within those services by just using AWS Copilot as a basic. So if we would have configured all the functionality that we just created, and you would push that environment up until AWS, the ECS registry automatically deploys the registry that you have created. So besides GitHub, there's also a registry which is private in this way, where the code base and the container automatically are being deployed. And as you see over here, I have 2 repositories being created, which have been enabled. Once all the pipelines are configured, this is a small example on what the functionality is and how AWS automatically creates these pipelines. And there's maybe a minor need to tweak. To be honest, it wasn't needed. But if you would like to tune something, it's possible, but it can be managed through the CLI in a basic sense. You can clone if needed, but in the basic, everything will be used again by the CLI. Once we have everything deployed, and I was using just one Docker container, and again, it's possible to use multiple ones, we can see an overview on what kind of clusters on Fargate are being deployed automatically and which tasks are being running. Again, I'm using only one container right now, but you can have multiple, of course, in regards to performance gain or scalability. For the performance test that I've done, even the smallest one was sufficient enough to have decent load tests against that. But I would say definitely test and how you would like to scale that. But the flexibility is already there, and that's in the configuration file by itself. I wanted to run almost 2 environments for a month. And in total, as you can see on the right, it was a little bit more than $52 for having a production environment and a staging environment running. Only the PWA Studio environment within ECS Fargate. The only most expensive functionality, as you can see in the diagram, was the load balancer itself. The container itself wasn't that expensive. So it's all about the load balancer, which is cost heavily, I would say. But keep in mind when running that. But I would say I was kind of surprised to see how flexible AWS has this function to deploy on an easy way at PWA Studio. Once we deployed the code, and I wanted to make sure that everything was running easily, I just created a small adjustment in the code, and that was mainly the logo. So I wanted to update the logo, which is ECS Fargate Prod, versus the test environment, making sure that once I deploy the image, and the only thing that I changed again was the logo, I wanted to make sure that all environments were running appropriately and had the appropriate files being located. Let me continue a little bit. So let's assume everything is up and running and you were using the distribution directory and you deployed everything up until AWS, but there was maybe need for more flexibility when automatically building PWA and having like a Kickstarter project. So what I've done is I wanted to create a small a Kickstarter, which can be run on macOS or Linux. I would say give it a try. And what it does, it automatically installs PWA Studio. So let me open up the install.sh file. It automatically clones the latest PWA Studio. It adds some additional scripts. Within that script, I'm adding a new command, which is build::serverless or build::serverless::test. And I will explain a little bit more why I created that. Once everything is up and running, I wanted to make sure that while using scaffolding, I had the ability to get some of the environment variables and post those environment variables within the serverless.sh file. Why I'm doing this? Well, the main reason is that I wanted to have a directory which automatically can be deployed to whatever Git repository, and that Git repository could connect to AWS. And that Git repository had 2 directories. One is called test and one is called production. And the reason why I wanted to do that is I wanted to have the flexibility that not all the code that I create, but the code itself had the ability to, once I push the code, it gets automatically deployed within that repository to AWS and creates the appropriate containers for that. It's a pretty, I would say, small file, which initially helps to use one command. And that command, besides the yarn run build, but now using the colon functionality, creates automatically a dedicated directory within your environment, which is not dist anymore. In this case, I renamed it to serverless and then /prod. And also there can be a directory /test. And those directories can help us to create an easy way to deploy our environments. So let me show the next thing, and then we can wrap it up, is that this Fargate demo environment, as we see, has a production environment with all the necessary files needed to create that specific container to deploy it. This one is for production and going back, and this one is for test. So this way I had the ability to more or less split production and test within one environment while running PWA Studio. Again, these are my personal interpretations. They're not related in any way to the production team from Adobe, but might it help you using multiple environments within PWA on how to deploy them again to AWS. And again, some of the documentations have been updated through a recent bit. And if there's any questions, of course, you can ask me moving forward. So let me go back to the slide deck. Let me continue over here. It's not creating. Hold on. So what are some of the takeaways once we start using that? First of all, we have three major components. One, we need to be aware of the deploy strategy. How are we going to do it? Do we need multiple instances, multiple repositories? How do we think about scaling? How do we scale? What's the configuration around that? Load balancers, no load balancers, and also the performance strategy in regards to the continuous integration, continuous development streamline. It's even possible, of course, to add a Lighthouse CI within that particular pipeline if needed. I would definitely recommend it because it will really help you to define anything before everything goes into production. Like I just mentioned, there are some repositories out there that I just shared, but this is a reference that you can use. So please, again, there's no reference to Adobe in any kind. These are my personal interpretation, and this is some of the code that I posted publicly for the community online, which can be used. If you would like to reach out and have more questions or other thoughts around best practices or reuse of some of the purposes, please write me up at my email address or at some of the social medias out there, for instance, like Twitter. So thanks again for attending this great event. I hope you liked it. And if there's any questions, let's jump into a Q&A section now. Thank you.
That's a lot of information to process. Thank you, Ray, for sharing it with us.
You're welcome.
I see that we have a few questions. So without further ado, let's move on to our first one. And it's from Max. How do you ensure that you won't have any problems with scalability? What best practice for monitoring PWAs? Any specific tools?
That's a good one. That's a really good one. Well, to be transparent, when looking at AWS, there's a functionality within ECS, since it's serverless, to scale automatically while using the appropriate configurations. I mean, now I show the manifest file, and that particular manifest file has, of course, the functionality and the flexibility to scale horizontally and virtually. So again, I would say look at the Copilot CI/CD and create the appropriate numbers when needed. And when within serverless, it will scale automatically when configured right, of course.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. What are other options for serverless PWA? Is AWS the best option?
That's a good one. I like that one. Well, I'm going to be honest here. Before I start using PWA, I was started using multiple services out there. Netlify, probably familiar, maybe if some of those are listening in. But to be honest, I had several issues deploying PWA Studio on those environments. Technically speaking, it can be done, but there were so many workarounds, and I think I've started using 3, 4. Some that were free, some that were paid. And at the end, it was not enough, and it didn't have a much flexibility that I wanted. So I thought to myself, playing around with AWS now on some of the accounts, how can this be done? And then by accident, I ran into AWS Copilot. And as of that, it really threw me away to say, well, this is so more flexible from a development point of view, let's start using that. But I was kind of curious to see how much it would be from a cost perspective. But at the end, I was kind of surprised to compare these against others. And I would say AWS sometimes seems to be expensive, but in this case, I was kind of surprised how well and how cheap it would be running PWA using these services from a basic point of view.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is from Daniel. What's the main benefit of deploying serverless?
Well, that's a really good one. Let's assume you would be running a PWA Studio environment, basically checking out the code and using the commands. It has the ability to already start using Node. But running a Node server on the background, maybe even in ECS2 or some other services, it could break. I've seen some backend services that needs to be running, making sure that Node itself is running fine. But this serverless fashion seems to me pretty lean and mean, because we only need to apply the code from the distribution directory which is needed, and help me to scale flexible while combining that with the Docker functionality. So only the files needed, the necessary tools applied, which keeps it really lean and mean and also easy to debug. And again, going back to my earlier, once the container is up and running on a local environment and you push that container into a serverless state, well, the serverless state will automatically handle the rest of it, and you don't need to be worrying about any tools moving forward.
I think we have one question left. Is AWS serverless approach popular today? Do you see many companies using or adopting it?
Yeah, that's also a good one. So in the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that currently we are working with a pretty large client, and this, I would say, idea, in some sense, it has been altered. I'm going to be really open on that. But the basic goal that I've just shared is being used on this pretty large enterprise moving forward. Although some of the components will be in the serverless function with Kubernetes, but the basic functionality that I just shared is still possible. But AWS has more ways on deploying this, and this is a really straightforward way to start using it without too much knowledge on AWS, using the appropriate tooling.
Right. Thank you again for joining us at for the Go PWA conference. We really appreciate it.